Kia ora tātou, good morning everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to share our research this morning. Today I'll be talking about our Get It Wet study, which was the first study to measure not only actual HIV infection by collecting oral fluid specimens, but particularly focusing on that portion which is undiagnosed. And today in particular this talk will be focusing on that latter group of people who are unaware of their HIV infection and the implications of that group for all of our practice. Now, as most of you will be aware, there was an HIV prevalence study conducted in sexual health clinics nationwide every 5 or 10 years, the last one being in 2005, 2006. And this was collecting HIV prevalence data on sexual health clinic attendees. And this was what we call, I suppose, a sentinel study, because it's looking at risk amongst those who present with STI risk. And we do that because we're interested in looking at this group because they provide an early warning perhaps of broader changes or emerging patterns of infection amongst the broader communities. It's a very important study for that reason. But it's less helpful at, I suppose, telling us about infection amongst the broader populations who aren't at particularly high risk of STIs and who don't present to sexual health clinics. So we're especially interested in what we would find if we broadened out the study sample to people who didn't go to clinics but were part of community settings, so men of sex with men who go to community settings, particularly MSM in Auckland, because our previous research has told us that that particular group has got a high prevalence of HIV. So why are we particularly interested in undiagnosed HIV? Well, I suppose obviously someone who isn't aware they have HIV infection won't be benefiting from treatments that can improve their CD4 and reduce their viral load. And this is data from the AIDS Epidemiology Group's routine surveillance, looking at diagnoses from 2005 to 2010. And what it shows is that of all those people diagnosed over that period, looking at MSM at the top row, around 41% were diagnosed at the time at which their CD4 count was 350 or less. And this is important because this is the stage at which we would normally look to initiate therapy. And fully a quarter of everyone newly diagnosed over that period presented at the stage where they would be defined as having AIDS or a CD4 count of 200 or less. Now, if we overlay that data with the median time to both of those two CD4 counts, to a CD4 count of 350 or less, it's an average about 4.2 years, and to a CD4 count of 200 or less, it's around 8 years. So many individuals are being diagnosed very late in the course of infection, which means that they're going for around 4 or 8 years not knowing they have HIV. So of course they're not benefiting from treatments, and in terms of their personal health and their personal care, that's not good news. Of course, not only that, but in terms of populational public health control, an individual who doesn't know they have HIV might not be practicing safe sex. They obviously also won't be on treatments which will be reducing their infectivity. So we know from several studies from mathematical models internationally that a very small proportion of individuals who aren't aware of their infection are disproportionately responsible for ongoing transmission events. And I think in Australia, for example, it was modelled that around 30% of new HIV transmissions were attributable to around 9% of HIV positive people who weren't aware of their infection. So for both personal care reasons and for epidemic control, we're really interested in this issue of undiagnosed infection. So very simply what we aimed to do was for the first time characterise the actual level of HIV infection amongst a community sample of MSM and look at the undiagnosed proportions, look at the magnitude of those two estimates. Want to learn more about the characteristics of those men with undiagnosed infection, and the whole point of this is to inform prevention, so to use this information to feed into all of our practice and inform public health control. Now, some of you will be aware of our studies. This is the GAP study, which was the platform on which we built this particular component. GAPS is the Gay Auckland Parent Sex Survey. It was begun in 2002. It was a self-completed anonymous survey which asks questions about sexual behaviours, sexual practices, attitudes and knowledge and testing. We recruit most of our sample from the Big Gay Out community event, around 70% of our sample, and then over the subsequent week, just over 1 week, we also recruit from gay bars and sex on-site venues like saunas. As you can see, we repeat that study then every 2 or 3 years, the idea being that we want to track or monitor changes in people's behaviours, changes in people's testing over time, and inform how we're going with various HIV prevention indicators. And as you can see, it's a very well-supported study from the community. So we regularly get over 1,200 participants, which for quite a small population is quite a significant effort. And I suppose the innovation that we did in 2011 was we got funding from the HRC to add on an oral fluid collection component. So of those individuals who had volunteered to take part in our GAP survey, we also invited them to provide an anonymous oral fluid specimen, which we would then test for HIV antibodies. So that's basically the background to how we did the study. This is how we collected the information on actual HIV status. It's the OraSure oral fluid collection device. It's not a test. It's not the OraQuick test. It just collects oral fluid. Very simply, the person puts this device into their mouth, holds it between their gums and teeth for 2 to 5 minutes, removes it, puts it into the vial, snaps it off and seals it. We then put a unique identical code on that vial and also on the participants' questionnaire, which they've self-completed. And we send them off in different directions. We send the vial off to the National Reference Laboratory in Melbourne, Australia, and that gets tested for HIV antibodies. We send the questionnaires down to our coders in Dunedin, and they enter the data on people's self-reported behaviours. And then we bring the two bits of information together at the end of the program. So we combine people's self-reported data on behaviours, on testing, on knowledge, with their actual HIV status as measured by HIV antibody tests. Now, as you'd expect, with quite a novel addition to quite a familiar program to most gay men in Auckland, we engage in extensive consultations about this new element. So we engage in several focus groups with MSM and Takatapui. We liaise with NGOs and venue owners. We pilot tested it several times. And of course we obtained ethics approval. In particular, we talked about some concerns amongst MSM about providing oral fluid specimens. Because we've never done this before in this country. And in particular, we talked to a lot of Takatapui and Māori health providers around particular cultural issues to do with provision and treatment of body specimens, and particularly cultural sensitivities around that. And as a result of those consultations, we changed aspects of what we plan to do. I suppose as it all boils down to, we wanted to conduct the survey in a gay affirmative way, so a way that affirmed and respected the concerns that MSM had about participating in the study. The protocols that we designed essentially boiled down to the fact that no harm should come to anyone who took part in the study. So of course it was voluntary, it was anonymous, there was no person identifying information, it was self-completed. We weren't delivering HIV test results to individuals, obviously it was anonymous so we couldn't, but it would also be inappropriate in the settings that we were conducting the research, which were gay bars, saunas, and a community picnic in the park. And everyone knew this, everyone was aware that they wouldn't be receiving their test results. However, everyone did receive a card with various HIV testing services on it, so if they were concerned about their status as a result of taking part, they left with that information. So how did we go? So over the 1-week study period in February 2011, our recruitment team, our fantastic recruitment team there in purple, approached 3,791 individuals, or made 3,791 approaches. We returned 1,304 questionnaires and received 1,049 viable specimens. That gives us a provision rate of around 80%, which I think was really good. We were really encouraged by that. In particular, we saw no variation in people's willingness to provide a specimen based on their age or their ethnicity. So those are two particular targets that we wanted to meet. And in fact, it was approximately 80% for each of those target groups. And when you looked across any characteristic of respondents, it never went below 70% and never above 90%. So a really solid provision rate across the entire sample. So what do we find? Well, of the 1,049 specimens provided, 68 tested positive for HIV antibodies. And 68 out of 149 is 6.5% of all our respondents were HIV positive at the time of survey. That's about 1 in 15 of our survey participants. Now, of course, we collected information on their demographic traits as well. So we can see how that overall 6.5% varied by different demographic traits. And in fact, we saw variation particularly in 2 traits, both in age and residency. As predicted, HIV prevalence increased with older age. So it was 8.9% amongst those aged over 45, compared to 3.3% or about 1 in 30 amongst MSM aged under 30. That's quite predictable, I suppose. We found that those participants who usually lived overseas had a much higher prevalence of HIV infection, about 13.7% compared to 6% of Auckland residents. And importantly, I put this up here because in fact we didn't find any variation in actual HIV prevalence by ethnicity. This is a really important goal of the study as well, to measure actual HIV prevalence by ethnicity. And in fact we found very little variation at all. So in particular you see there HIV prevalence amongst European was 6.7%, amongst Māori it was 6.4%. Amongst Pacific it looks a little bit higher at 10.3%, but I draw your attention to the fact there was very few respondents. Only 3 respondents tested positive out of 29, and simply put, the confidence intervals around that are so wide we can't be confident that that's a real difference. So in fact we said there's no difference by ethnicity in terms of actual HIV prevalence. Of course, by combining that data also with people's recent behaviours, we can tell more about both acquisition and transmission risks. So again, predictably, we found that HIV prevalence was higher at around 13% among people who reported over 20 sexual partners in the last 6 months. We found that it was higher again, around about 12% amongst MSM who reported any unprotected casual sex in the last 6 months. Again, not particularly surprising. We also found it was elevated at just under 10% amongst men who had recently acquired a sexual partner online. And as you can see, quite a lot higher amongst the group of individuals who reported any recent injecting drug use behaviour. But again, I'll just point out this was true for a very small portion of our overall sample. So although it was very high at 20%, it was only true for 3 individuals out of our entire sample. So that's overall HIV prevalence. What do we know about undiagnosed HIV prevalence, or the group of individuals who weren't aware that they had HIV at the time of study? Well, of the 68 respondents whose specimens tested positive, 1 in fact didn't report any information on their testing behaviours. So we have to exclude them. So of the 67, 14 were deemed unaware of their status at the time of survey. This essentially means that they either said they had never tested for HIV in their life before, or they had tested for HIV previously and that last test had been negative. So that's how we characterise the proportion of people who weren't aware at the time of survey that they were in fact HIV positive. And that's true for 1 in 5, so 21% of all our HIV positive respondents in the survey. So 1 in 5 of those infected weren't aware they had HIV at the time of survey. Putting that in the context of the total sample, that's about 1.3%, or about 1 in 80 of all our participants. So what do we know about this group? Well, of course, it's a very small group. It's a much smaller group, only 14 individuals, but we can say some things about them. First of all, and perhaps quite surprisingly, at least to me, we found that most people had in fact tested for HIV at some time in the past. In fact, almost 80% had in fact tested at least once, and about half of those respondents had tested negative in the last 12 months, and obviously had acquired HIV since that last negative test. Unsurprisingly, the majority of those individuals, when asked what they currently believed their actual HIV status to be, 85% reported on their questionnaire that they were either definitely sure they were negative or probably sure they were negative. When we looked at variation in this diagnosis rate, so looking at that group of people with HIV and looking at the portion who were undiagnosed, was there any variation by demographic characteristics? In fact, what we found was there was very little. It was a small group, so our ability to detect differences wasn't that great. But what we did find is when we grouped all non-European respondents together, because again the numbers were very small, so we grouped Māori, Pacific and Asian respondents together, we found that although again there was no difference in actual HIV infection across ethnicity, of those people who were infected, non-European respondents were less likely to have been diagnosed. So in fact, about 90% of European respondents who had HIV knew that, but that was only true for about 50% of non-European respondents with HIV. So quite a big difference in diagnosis rates amongst people with HIV. And there was also suggestion, but it didn't reach statistical significance, that this could also be true amongst younger MSM with HIV, that their diagnosis rate was lower than older MSM with HIV. A little bit more information, in fact, I don't think is in the paper. We looked at sexual health checks. In fact, Similarly to HIV, around half of these individuals who weren't aware they had HIV had been for a sexual health check in the last 12 months. Of those 8, 2 had been to a sexual health clinic and 5 had been to a GP for that sexual health check. That's a little bit different than the distribution we normally see. It's a bit more even. So there's a few individuals going for a sexual health check at a clinic than at the GP than we'd normally expect to see. And only one of those individuals self-reported an STI in the last 12 months. And in fact, this is very similar to what we find with the rest of the sample. That around 8 to 10% of all our respondents were reporting an STI in the last 12 months. So again, having a positive STI test in the last 12 months wasn't particularly predictive of currently being unaware they had HIV. Interestingly, that individual had gonorrhea. So what else do we know? Again, the numbers are very small. What else do we know about their behaviours? And this again goes to the issue of their HIV acquisition risk or their HIV transmission risk to other individuals. So looking at those 14 respondents, and bearing in mind it's a very small group, 2 reported over 20 sexual partners in the last 6 months, and 6 reported that they had sex with a man they had met online on an online dating site in the last 6 months as well. We found some interesting things when we looked at recent sexual practices. For example, 3 or 20, a quarter of them reported that they had engaged in any unprotected sex with a casual partner in the last 6 months. Again, we don't know, because of the timing of their infection, whether this preceded or followed their actual infection. So this may have been the reason why they became infected in the first place, or they may have been infected a long time ago, and this result represents an ongoing transmission risk to their casual sexual partners. Similarly, in fact, we found a higher proportion were currently having unprotected sex with their regular partner. So 5 individuals who weren't aware they had HIV were currently having unprotected sex with their regular partner. And in fact, we know a little bit more about that. 4 of those 8 respondents, about half of those respondents were having sex with a partner described as fuck buddy, or a friend they have sex with, and the other half were having sex with a regular partner they were described as a boyfriend. So quite an even mix in terms of the type of regular relationship those men with undiagnosed HIV were having sex with. And I guess just getting a feel about how that data compares to other respondents. Again, we didn't do any formal statistical comparisons because the numbers were too small, so we have to be very cautious about saying too much about what this data means, or interpreting what this data means. But as you can see on the left-hand column there, these are the same behaviours as reported by our HIV-negative respondents, so actually uninfected respondents at the time of the survey. On the right-hand column, those people who tested positive, but who reported that they had known that they were positive. And again, I guess the most you could probably say, because of the small numbers of respondents in that middle column, was that there is a suggestion that that group had a slightly higher number of sexual partners perhaps, and was slightly more likely to seek partners on the internet. But that's about all you can say. When you look at casual sex, for example, they really report very similar frequencies to people who are actually HIV negative. So not an awful lot we can say about that. And in fact, these individuals may have just been unlucky. So, that's sort of the main findings. We always like to talk about our limitations and reflect on what they might be and how they might interpret our findings. First of all, although it's a non-clinic study, it was conducted in community settings, so gay bars, gay saunas and community events. So we can't formally generalise out our data to all MSM in Auckland because not everyone goes to those venues. Having said that, most of our sample, around 70%, comes from the Big Gay Out Fair Day, which is a large community event. And we think that's sort of the best approximation of sort of your average gay male that you can get in research in Auckland. So it's a pretty fair approximation, we feel. And in fact, if you exclude those individuals who are recruited from gay bars and gay saunas, if you exclude those individuals, the findings are about the same. So the overall prevalence of HIV drops from 6.5% down to 6%, and the undiagnosed fraction of that reduces from 21 to 19%. So pretty much overall the results stay the same. What are some of the strengths? Well, again, it's a non-clinic sample with a very large number of respondents and a very diverse sample range. So we were able to investigate the experiences of very small subgroups of our respondents, which is a real benefit. We were able to demonstrate the very high acceptability of collecting oral fluid samples in these settings amongst MSM in New Zealand for the first time. So this is very obviously pleasing for our own study, but also promising for future research. Again, we're able to combine a biological measure of HIV infection with self-reported behaviours, and that was actually relatively straightforward after done a bit of planning and pilot testing. And of course, because we've introduced the study on top of an existing ongoing surveillance project with consistent recruitment over time, we're able to repeat the study in the future and get a comparable measure of overall HIV prevalence, and in particular the proportion that's undiagnosed. That actually gives us a target to work towards. We know we can repeat the study in the future, and we're hoping that we can reduce the reduction in the proportion who are undiagnosed. How do we compare internationally? Well, this is looking at other comparable surveys that recruit from community settings internationally, and our results are down the bottom there. So again, 6.5% overall, and the undiagnosed fraction of 21%. The first thing you'll notice, this is listed in chronological order, is that we have a large number of respondents. We're really pleased with that. We sort of match up pretty well with other studies internationally. But just focusing on a couple, I suppose. For example, the US, they found that overall prevalence was 17.4% in 2008, so much higher than our 6.5%. And their undiagnosed proportion was 76%, so much higher than what we found here as well. Oh, sorry, 43%. We look at, I suppose, one of the most recent, more recent studies, which is in Melbourne, and again, cut in a very similar way to our own study in Auckland. They found that 9.5% were actually positive, and just under a third, or 31% of that, were undiagnosed. So again, in the international context, our findings in New Zealand match up pretty well, which I think says some encouraging things about a relatively favourable experience of HIV prevention in this country compared to similar jurisdictions that we'd like to compare ourselves against. So I've just sort of, I guess, highlighted three things to finish on, which I thought might be relevant to improving or informing our own practice, whether as nurses or health promoters or clinicians or policymakers or researchers. The first one I want to highlight is, obviously amongst those individuals who are infected, we want to improve diagnosis rates. So we found that 1 in 5 of those with HIV were unaware. That's actually pretty good internationally, as you saw from the last slide. It's not particularly high. We want that to get lower, so we want to improve that diagnosis rate. In particular, we found that diagnosis rates were lower amongst some subgroups, in particular non-European MSM who had HIV. So we want to make our services more accessible, we want to promote our testing services, and increase the frequency of testing amongst all MSM, but particularly amongst those individuals who are less likely to have their infection diagnosed. We want to do that because we essentially want to reduce the time from acquisition, HIV acquisition, to diagnosis, and move these people into care as quickly as possible and link them to services. That, of course, is for the benefit of the individual, but a consequence of that also for their sexual partners and for public health control is that we'll be reducing their infectivity by enabling counselling and encouraging adoption of safe sex behaviours, and also if they're on treatments, obviously reducing viral load. Secondly, what about people who are uninfected? And I think if we think about the sort of situations that gay men find themselves in when they're hooking up or seeking sexual partners, how can we use this information to challenge some of their assumptions or challenge some of their approaches to safe sex? Well, first of all, again, most of the individuals who had HIV infection but weren't aware had in fact tested for HIV and believed that they weren't infected. In fact, many had quite strong convictions that they were HIV negative, and I imagine it wouldn't be a stretch to assume that they were quite certain that they were HIV negative and may have communicated that quite convincingly to sexual partners. I think we can think about what we see on internet dating profiles, for example, on Grindr or NZ dating. Often we see words like, I'm clean, I'm clear, I've tested 6 months ago, I've tested 3 months ago. I think the implication of that is that the individual feels that it's safe to engage in unprotected sex. So I think we want to use this information to challenge people's assumptions that just talking about when they had a test or feeling that they're negative is an accurate way to minimise your risk of HIV. I also think it reminds us that these disclosure-based approaches to prevention, i.e. just talking about testing and talking about how you feel about your own HIV status, are inherently flawed. Because, of course, if you don't know you have HIV, you can't tell someone that you're positive. It's a fundamental flaw of these disclosure-based approaches, and I think, again, it reminds us that other approaches like condom use get around this problem because they're instantly and immediately verifiable to both sexual partners. So both sexual partners can see the condom, they know it's there, they know the sex they're about to have is going to be safe. And lastly, I suppose this is more of a policy or a strategy issue. Don't zero sum. Having said that we need to increase the frequency of testing, even if we elevate testing frequency to very high levels, it's unlikely that that on its own is going to stop the epidemic. And that's true because we always know there's going to be this gap between someone acquiring HIV and then testing and being diagnosed. And that gap may be very short, several months, or take several years, as we saw in the first slides. That's going to be particularly true for individuals with high rates of partner change, who quite simply are not going to test as often as they change partners. So I think we need to reflect on those sorts of issues and wonder whether amongst MSM, particularly high-risk MSM, a purely testing-based approach is fit for purpose, or whether in fact we also need to support an increase in testing with what we know to be effective, which is condom-based approaches. So I think I would argue that yes, we need to increase testing, but we need to match that increase in testing and match the investment in testing with an equally large investment in promoting condoms and making sure that we're preventing infection happening in the first place, not just getting better at diagnosing. Last couple of slides. Our team is very committed to disseminating this information, and we've put a lot of effort into getting it out there and encouraging people to reflect on this information and inform their own practice and that of their clients. So, as well as the academic outputs, which are available free online from BMC Public Health, we made sure that we disseminated it to the media, to gay communities, and had presences and gay community events like a Fair Day. In fact, I've got the last few brochures of these, if you're interested in taking some of those home for our members of your team, which summarise the findings here today. We've also engaged in a number of stakeholder presentations. The focus of this one, of course, has been on undiagnosed HIV. We've also talked about overall infection methods, so we're really committed to sharing this information with people who might use it. And I guess the next questions we have, we always like to think about what next. Well, first of all, there was variation in rates of diagnosis, so what do we know about testing rates and how that varies amongst different subgroups of gay men? We've got that information gap, Scott, so it'll be really interesting to look at that information at some time in the future, and we're looking at commissioning that hopefully sometime. And we've demonstrated that we can obtain some really interesting information on actual HIV infection amongst this group. But what about STIs? I think we're really keen to look at the prevalence of a range of STIs amongst MSM and also the proportion who are undiagnosed or aren't aware of the infection in relation to these other STIs. That's it. I'd just like to acknowledge in particular co-researchers, and Tony Hughes is here today, and the men who took part in the study for their patience and willingness to contribute a piece of themselves, I suppose, for our research. Thanks.